The rain was falling hard on that cold November morning when two young men stepped off a bus in downtown Chicago. They carried old instrument cases that had seen better days. One case had a small crack running down its side, held together with black tape. The other had a broken handle, so the young man carrying it had to hold it with both arms like a baby. Oliver and Henry were twins, not the kind you see in movies with perfect matching clothes and bright smiles. These two had grown up hard. Their mother left when they were just 3 years old. Their father worked 2 jobs and was never home. So their grandmother, a kind woman named Dorothy, raised them in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Detroit. That apartment had thin walls. You could hear the washing machines running all day and all night. The sound of spinning clothes became the background music of their childhood. But somehow, in that small and noisy place, 2 boys fell in love with classical music. It started when Oliver was 4. He found an old violin in a garbage bin behind their building. It was missing 1 string and the wood was scratched. But when he brought it home, his grandmother's eyes filled with tears. She told him it looked just like the one her father used to play back in the old country. Henry wanted to play too. So their grandmother saved money for 6 months and bought him a used cello from a pawn shop. It cost her $80, which was a lot of money for a woman who worked as a cleaner at a hospital. The boys had no money for lessons. No teacher would come to their neighborhood anyway, so they learned from whatever they could find. Library books with pictures showing where to put your fingers, old videotapes from the public library. And later, when the internet came along, they watched hundreds of hours of tutorials on a borrowed laptop. Their grandmother would sit in her old chair every evening and listen to them practice. Even when they made terrible sounds, and they made many terrible sounds in those early years, she would clap and tell them they were wonderful. She believed in them when no one else did. Years passed. The boys grew into young men. They practiced every single day without fail. When other kids were playing outside, Oliver and Henry were in their small room playing scales and working through difficult pieces. Their fingers became hard with calluses, their backs ADHD from hours of sitting. But they never complained. By the time they turned 19, something beautiful had happened. They could play together in a way that was almost magical. They did not need to look at each other to know what was coming next. They breathed together. They felt the music in the same way at the same moment. It was like they shared one mind. When they played, their grandmother saw an advertisement in a newspaper one day. The National Youth Symphony Orchestra was holding open auditions in Chicago. It was one of the most famous youth orchestras in the country. Getting in would change everything. It would mean scholarships, professional training, and a real future in music. She showed the paper to the boys. They looked at each other and knew immediately that they had to try. The audition fee was $200. They did not have $200, so Oliver took extra shifts at the grocery store where he worked, stocking shelves. Henry sold his bicycle, the only thing of value he owned. Their grandmother added what little she had saved. Finally, they had enough. They sent in their application and received a letter telling them to come to Chicago on November 15th at 10 in the morning. The night before the audition, their grandmother sat them down at the kitchen table. She held their hands and looked at them with love in her tired eyes. "I want you to know something," she said. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I am proud of you. You have worked harder than anyone I know. You have talent that came from God Himself. But more than that, you have heart, and heart is something no one can teach." The boys hugged her tight. They did not sleep much that night. The bus ride to Chicago took 5 hours. They could not afford train tickets. They sat in the back with their instruments on their laps, too nervous to eat the sandwiches. Their grandmother had packed for them. When they arrived at the concert hall, Oliver felt his stomach drop. The building was enormous. It had tall white columns and giant glass doors. Young musicians walked in wearing expensive clothes and carrying instrument cases. Hat probably cost more than everything the twins owned put together. Inside, The lobby was filled with parents and coaches and students who looked like they belonged there. Oliver and Henry stood near the door, feeling very small. Their clothes were old. Henry's jacket had a hole near the elbow that he tried to cover with his hand. A woman with a clipboard called their names. They followed her down a long hallway and through a heavy door into the main auditorium. The stage was huge, lit by bright lights from above. The seats stretched back into darkness, row after row of red velvet chairs. At a table near the front sat 3 judges. 2 of them were looking at papers, but the man in the middle was watching them. His name was Richard Whitmore. He was the conductor of the National Youth Symphony, and he was famous in the classical music world. He had trained at the best schools in Europe. He had led orchestras in London and Vienna and New York. His opinion could make or break a young musician's career. When Oliver and Henry walked onto that stage, Richard Whitmore looked at them from head to toe. He saw their old clothes. He saw the tape on Oliver's violin case. He saw the way Henry held his cello case with both arms because the handle was broken. And then he did something that cut deeper than any knife. He laughed. It was not a loud laugh, just a small chuckle. But in that silent hall, it echoed. He leaned over to his assistant, a young woman with glasses, and said something. Shh. E covered her mouth and smiled. The twins heard him clearly. Let us see what the streets of Detroit have sent us today. Oliver felt his face grow hot. Henry's hands started to shake, but they walked to the center of the stage anyway. They had come too far to turn back now. They set up their music stands. They tuned their instruments with trembling fingers, and then with one shared breath they began to play. They had chosen a piece by Brahms. It was difficult and beautiful. A conversation between violin and cello that showed everything they had learned over 15 years of practice. For the first 30 seconds, the hall was filled with their music. Then Richard Whitmore raised his hand. Stop, he said. The music died. The twins stood frozen, their bows still touching the strings. That is enough, the conductor said. He was not even looking at them now. He was writing something on a notepad. Thank you for coming. You may leave. Oliver Unk's voice came out as a whisper. Sir, we have not finished the piece. Richard Whitmore finally looked up. His eyes were cold. Young man, I have heard enough. Your technique is rough. Your instruments are poor. This orchestra requires musicians who have received proper training, not self-taught boys from a laundromat. He knew about the laundromat. He had read their application, and he was using it against them. Henry spoke now, his voice stronger than he felt. We have worked for 15 years. Every single day we taught ourselves everything. The conductor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That is exactly the problem. Passion without proper guidance is just noise. Perhaps try a community center. They might appreciate your enthusiasm. The other judges said nothing. They looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. The woman with the clipboard appeared beside them. This way, please, she said softly. The walk off that stage was the longest walk of their lives. Behind them, they could hear Richard Whitmore telling his assistant to call in the next candidate, as if the twins had never been there at all. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray. They stood on the sidewalk, not speaking. Their instruments hung heavy in their hands. Finally, Henry looked at his brother. Tears were running down his face, but his jaw was set. He laughed at us. Henry said, Yes, Oliver replied. He will remember us. Yes, Oliver said again. He will. They did not know it yet. But that terrible morning was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The bus ride home felt like it lasted forever. Oliver sat by the window, watching the gray world pass by without really seeing it. Henry sat beside him, staring at his hands. Neither of them spoke for the first 2 hours. The sandwiches their grandmother had made were still in the bag, untouched. Neither brother could eat. Their stomachs were too full of shame and anger, and something else they could not name. Somewhere past the Indiana border, Henry finally broke the silence. He did not even let us finish, he said quietly. 30 seconds. He gave us 30 seconds. Oliver nodded but said nothing. 15 years, Henry continued, his voice growing stronger. 15 years of practice, of sacrifice, of dreaming about this moment. And he stopped us after 30 seconds because he did not like our clothes. Oliver turned from the window. His eyes were red, but there were no tears left. It was not just the clothes. He saw where we came from. He read our application. He knew about the laundromat, about teaching ourselves. He decided we were nothing before we even played a single note. The bus hit a bump in the road. Their instrument cases shifted on the overhead rack. Henry looked up at them, at the cracked case and the broken handle, and felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. Maybe he was right, Henry whispered. Oliver grabbed his brother's arm. Do not say that. Do not ever say that. But look at us, Oliver. Look at our instruments. Look at our cases. Everyone in that building had teachers and coaches and parents who could afford lessons. They had proper training. What do we have? Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm but filled with something hard as stone. We have each other. We have 15 years of work that nobody can take away. And we have a grandmother who believed in us when the whole world told her she was wasting her time. Henry looked at his brother. The shame in his chest began to shift into something else, something warmer. What are we going to do? He asked. Oliverunk's jaw tightened. We are going to make him remember our names, not as the boys he laughed at, but as the musicians he was too blind to see. When the bus finally pulled into Detroit, it was already dark. The streets were wet from earlier rain, and the streetlights made everything glow orange. They walked the familiar route home, past the corner store where they used to buy candy as kids, past the park where they had played their first outdoor concert for an audience of pigeons, and one homeless man who clapped like they were at Carnegie Hall. The laundromat was closed for the night, but they could see the light on in the apartment above. Their grandmother was waiting. She opened the door before they could knock. One look at their faces told her everything she needed to know. She did not ask questions. She simply opened her arms and held them both the way she had when they were small boys who had scraped their knees or had bad dreams. They sat at the kitchen table. Dorothy made tea, the cheap kind that came in boxes of 100 bags for $3. She set the cups in front of them and waited. Oliver told her everything. The fancy building, the rich students, the conductor with cold eyes, the laugh that had cut through them like broken glass, the words that still echoed in their minds. When he finished, Dorothy was quiet. Her hands wrapped around her own cup of tea, and she looked at the steam rising from it for a long time. Richard Whitmore, she finally said. I have heard that name before. He is famous. Yes, very famous, Henry said bitterly. He has conducted orchestras all over the world. His opinion matters. If he says we are nothing, then we are nothing. Dorothy looked up sharply. Is that what you believe? Henry hesitated. Oliver stayed silent. Let me tell you something, their grandmother said. She leaned forward, and her eyes, tired as they were, held a fire the boys had rarely seen. When I was a young woman, people told me many things. They told me I would never leave my village. They told me I was too poor to dream. They told me a woman like me could never raise 2 boys alone. And look at me now. She gestured around the small kitchen. It was not much. The paint was peeling. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. But it was home. I did not listen to them, she continued. And you will not listen to this conductor. One man's opinion is not the truth. It is just one man's opinion. And sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are the ones who are most afraid of being wrong. Oliver looked at his grandmother. What should we do? Dorothy smiled, and it was the same smile she had given them when they first showed her that broken violin from the garbage bin. You practice, you get better, and then you show the world what you are made of. Not for him, not to prove him wrong, but for yourselves, because you love music, because it lives in your bones. That is something no conductor can give you, and no conductor can take away. Tea. At night, the twins could not sleep. They lay in their small shared room, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the washing machines had stopped, but they could still hear the distant rumble of trucks on the highway. "She is right," Oliver said into the darkness. "I know," Henry replied. "We need a plan, a real plan, not just practice. We need to become so good that no one can ever dismiss us again." Henry turned on his side to face his brother. "How? We have no money for teachers, no connections, no fancy school will accept us." Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he sat up. And even in the darkness, Henry could see the determination on his face. "We find another way. There are videos online of the greatest musicians in the world. There are master classes we can watch for free. There are books in the library that teach technique and theory. We have learned everything on our own so far. We can keep learning." But he said our technique was rough. He said passion without guidance is just noise. Oliver Unk's voice hardened. "Then we will make our noise so beautiful that he will have no choice but to call it music." Henry sat up too. For the first time since that terrible audition, he felt something like hope. "There is something else," Oliver said slowly. "Something I have been thinking about on the bus. We play well together. Better than any two people I have ever seen. We know each other so completely that we do not need words. We do not need signals. We just feel it." "So what? So we use that. We do not just play existing pieces. We create something new, something that only we can play, something so difficult, so connected that no one else in the world could perform it the same way." Henry stared at his brother. "You want us to compose our own music?" "Yes, a duet, a conversation between violin and cello, something that shows what we are, two people who share the same heart." The idea hung in the air between them. It was crazy. They had never composed anything before. They had no training in composition. But as Henry thought about it, he realized it was also perfect. "If we do this," Henry said slowly, "it has to be something special. Something that proves we are not just street musicians with broken instruments. Something that makes people stop and listen." Oliver nodded. "It will take time, maybe years, but we have nothing but time and each other and each other." They shook hands in the darkness, a promise sealed without words. They did not know how long the road ahead would be. They did not know how much pain and sacrifice waited for them. But in that moment, they made a choice. They would not let one man's laughter define their lives. They would write their own story, and they would make sure the whole world heard it. The next 2 years were the hardest of their lives, but they were also the years that shaped them into something extraordinary. It started the very next morning after their pact. Oliver woke up before sunrise and began searching online for jobs. Henry did the same. They needed money to survive, but more importantly, they needed to find a way to keep practicing while paying their share of rent and helping their grandmother. Oliver found work at a warehouse on the night shift. The hours were brutal. From 10 at night until 6 in the morning, he would come home exhausted, his body aching from lifting heavy boxes for 8 hours straight. But instead of sleeping, he would pick up his violin and practice for 3 hours before finally allowing himself to rest. Henry got a job at a hospital as a cleaner. He mopped floors and emptied trash cans and scrubbed toilets. It was not glamorous work, but it paid enough. His shift ended at 4 in the afternoon, which gave him the evening hours to practice. He would play until his fingers could not move anymore, then fall asleep with his cello, still leaning against his bed. Their grandmother watched them with worried eyes. She saw how tired they were. She saw the dark circles under their eyes and the way they sometimes fell asleep at the dinner table. But she also saw something else. She saw fire. She saw determination that would not die no matter how hard the world tried to put it out. 3 months into this new routine, something unexpected happened. It was a Sunday afternoon. Henry was playing his cello on the corner near the old library, the same spot where they had performed as children. He was not playing for money. He just needed fresh air and a change of scenery. The small apartment would feel like a prison sometimes. An old woman stopped to listen. She had white hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a long gray coat despite the warm weather. She stood perfectly still, her eyes closed, listening to every note. When Henry finished the piece, she opened her eyes and walked toward him. "That was Dvorak," she said. "The cello concerto second movement." Henry nodded, surprised. Most people who stopped to listen did not know classical music. "Your technique is rough in places," the woman continued, "but your feeling is extraordinary. Where did you study?" Henry felt his face grow warm. "I did not study anywhere. My brother and I taught ourselves." The woman's eyebrows rose. "Taught yourselves? That is remarkable and also a waste." Henry felt the familiar sting of shame. "We tried to audition for the National Youth Symphony. The conductor laughed at us." "Richard Whitmore?" the woman asked. "You know him?" The woman smiled, but there was something sad in it. "I taught him 30 years ago, when he was young and hungry and had none of the arrogance he carries now." Henry stared at her. "You taught the conductor?" "I taught many conductors, many soloists, many musicians who now play in the greatest orchestras in the world." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small card. "My name is Eleanor Price. I was a professor at the conservatory for 40 years before I retired." Henry took the card with trembling fingers. The name meant nothing to him, but the weight of her words did. Were you telling me this?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him with eyes that had seen 1,000 students come and go. "Because I have heard many musicians in my life. Some had perfect technique, some had expensive instruments and famous teachers, but very few had what you have. Soul, that is something you cannot teach." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Bring your brother to my house next Saturday. I want to hear you play together. If you are as good as I think you are, perhaps I can help." That Saturday changed everything. Oliver and Henry arrived at Eleanor's house, nervous and unsure. The house was old but beautiful, filled with books and framed photographs of orchestras and concert halls. A grand piano sat in the living room, and the walls were covered with awards and diplomas. They played for her. They played the same bronze piece they had tried to perform at the audition, but this time no one stopped them. Eleanor sat in her chair with her eyes closed, listening to every note, every breath, every moment of silence between phrases. When they finished, she did not speak for a long time. "Richard was a fool to dismiss you," she finally said. "Your technique needs work. Your instruments are barely holding together, but what you have together is rare. The way you communicate without words, the way you breathe is one that cannot be learned. That is a gift." She agreed to teach them for free. Every Saturday and Sunday, they would come to her house and work on technique, theory, and musicality. She pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed. She made them play scales until their fingers burned. She corrected their posture, their bowing, their breathing. She taught them things that no YouTube video could ever teach, but she also encouraged them to keep working on their own composition. "You told me you want to create something only you can play," she said one afternoon. "Show me what you have." They played the few minutes they had written so far. It was rough and unfinished, but the idea was there. A conversation between two instruments, a story of two brothers who shared one heart. Eleanor listened carefully. When they stopped, she nodded slowly. "This is good, but it is not enough. If you want to make the world listen, you need to make them feel something they have never felt before. Push further. Take risks. Make it impossible for anyone else to play." So they did. For the next 18 months, Oliver and Henry worked on their composition. They called it Unbreakable. It was a piece that required perfect synchronization. One brother would start a phrase, and the other would finish it. They would play different melodies that somehow became one. The timing had to be exact. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the whole piece would fall apart. They practiced it over and over in the early morning before work, late at night when the world was quiet, on weekends at Eleanor's house. While she watched and corrected and encouraged slowly, The piece to berber. Okay shape. 12 minutes of music that told their story. The struggle, the pain, the laughter of a conductor who did not believe in them, and finally the triumph of two brothers who refused to give up. When they finally played the complete piece for Eleanor, she had tears in her eyes. "This is it," she said softly. "This is what will make them remember your names." She told them about a competition, the International Virtuoso competition in Vienna. It was one of the most prestigious events in the classical music world. The best young musicians from every country competed for a chance to perform on the greatest stages. The judges were conductors and soloists and professors from the finest institutions. And one of those judges was Richard Whitmore. He will be there. Eleanor said, "This is your chance, not for revenge, but for truth to show him and everyone else what he missed when he laughed at you." The entry fee was expensive. The plane tickets to Vienna were even more expensive. The twins had saved some money, but it was not nearly enough. Their grandmother solved the problem. One evening, she sat them down at the kitchen table. In her hand was a small velvet box. Inside was a gold ring, simple but beautiful. "This was your grandfather's wedding ring," she said. "He gave it to me the day we married. 53 years ago. I have kept it close to my heart ever since." Oliver shook his head. "Grandmother, no, we cannot take this." Dorothy pressed the box into his hands. "Your grandfather loved music. He would have loved to hear you play. He would want you to have this chance. Sell it. Go to Vienna. Make us proud." The twins looked at each other. There were no words for what they felt. 3 days later, they had their plane tickets. Vienna was waiting. Vienna was nothing like Detroit. The streets were clean and wide. The buildings were old and beautiful with carved stone walls and tall windows that caught the afternoon light. Music seemed to float in the air itself, coming from cafes and street corners and open windows where someone was always practicing piano or violin. Oliver and Henry arrived 3 days before the competition. They had never been on a plane before. They had never left the country before. Everything felt like a dream they might wake up from at any moment. Their hotel was small and cheap on a narrow street far from the city center. The room had 2 tiny beds and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. But they did not care. They were in Vienna. They were going to perform at the International Virtuoso competition. Nothing else mattered. The first 2 days they practiced in their hotel room with towels stuffed under the door so they would not disturb the other guests. They played Unbreakable over and over, making sure every note was perfect, every breath was synchronized, every transition was smooth. On the night before the competition, Oliver could not sleep. He stood by the window looking at the small patch of sky visible above the brick wall. Henry came and stood beside him. "Are you scared?" Henry asked. Oliver nodded slowly. "Yes, but not of losing. I am scared of seeing him again, Richard Whitmore. I am scared of what I might feel when I look at his face." Henry understood. For 2 years that man's laughter had lived in their heads. They had used it as fuel to push themselves harder. But now that the moment was almost here, the old wounds felt fresh again. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Henry said, "we have already won. We are here. We made it this far." 2 boys from a laundromat in Detroit standing in Vienna about to perform our own music on one of the greatest stages in the world. No one can take that away from us. Oliver looked at his brother in the dim light. He could see the same determination he felt in his own heart. "Let us make grandmother proud," Oliver said. "Let us make Eleanor proud," Henry added. "Let us make ourselves proud." They shook hands just like they had on that night 2 years ago when they made their pact. Then they went to bed and somehow finally found sleep. The morning of the competition arrived with bright sunshine. The twins put on the only nice clothes they owned, simple black shirts and black pants that Eleanor had bought for them as a gift. They polished their instruments until they shone. They looked at each other in the mirror and saw 2 young men, who had come a long way from the boys who used to practice in a tiny room above a laundromat. The competition was held at the Music Fin, one of the most famous concert halls in the world. When the twins saw it for the first time, they stopped walking and just stared. The building was magnificent, with golden decorations and tall columns and an entrance that seemed to welcome only the most worthy musicians. Inside the hall was even more breathtaking. The ceiling was painted with angels and clouds, the walls were lined with golden carvings, and the stage, the famous stage where the greatest musicians in history had performed, was waiting for them. The competition had 42 participants from 26 countries. There were pianists and violinists and cellists, all young, all talented, all dreaming of victory. The twins watched some of them warm up backstage. Their technique was flawless. Their instruments were worth more than houses. Their confidence was obvious in the way they moved and spoke. Oliver felt a knot form in his stomach. Henry noticed and put a hand on his shoulder. "Do not watch them," Henry said quietly. "They are not our competition. We are only competing with ourselves." The twins were scheduled to perform in the afternoon session. They found a quiet corner backstage and sat with their instruments, eyes closed, breathing slowly, preparing their minds, and then they saw him. Richard Whitmore walked through the backstage area like he owned it. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the same arrogance the twins remembered from 2 years ago. He was talking to another judge, laughing about something, completely unaware that 2 young men were watching him from across the room. Oliver's hands tightened on his violin case. All the anger, all the hurt, all the humiliation came rushing back. For a moment he wanted to walk over there and say something, anything to make him remember what he had done. But Henry held him back. "Not now," Henry whispered. "Let the music speak for us." They watched Richard Whitmore disappear through a door that led to the judge's area. Then they went back to preparing. The hours passed slowly. One by one, musicians took the stage and performed. Some were brilliant, some made mistakes, some received standing ovations, some received polite applause. The twins did not watch. They stayed in their corner, focused only on what was coming. Finally, at 3:47 in the afternoon, a staff member came to get them. "You are next," she said. The walk to the stage felt like walking through water. Every step was heavy. Every heartbeat was loud in their ears. They could hear the announcer introducing them. "Next, we have Oliver and Henry from the United States. They will perform an original composition titled Unbreakable." A murmur went through the audience. Original compositions were rare in this competition. Most participants played pieces by famous composers. Playing your own music was a risk. The twins stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, almost blinding. The audience stretched back into darkness. Hundreds of faces they could not see clearly, but they could see T. He judged his table at the front, and they could see Richard Whitmore sitting in the center. For one terrible moment, the world seemed to stop. Oliver looked directly at the conductor. The man did not appear to recognize them. Why would he? They had been nothing to him. Just 30 seconds of noise that he had dismissed and forgotten. But the twins remembered. They walked to the center of the stage. They set up their music stands. They tuned their instruments with steady hands. The hall fell completely silent. Oliver looked at Henry. Henry looked at Oliver. They did not need words. They did not need signals. They simply breathed together the way they had done 10,000 times before. And then they began to play. The first notes of Unbreakable floated into the air like a question. Oliver's violin sang a melody that was sad and lonely. Then Henry's cello answered deep and warm like a comforting embrace. The two voices wove together, separated, found each other again. The piece told their story. The struggle of 2 boys who had nothing but each other and a dream. The pain of being laughed at by someone who should have known better. The long nights of practice when their fingers bled and their bodies ached. The love of a grandmother who never stopped believing. The kindness of a teacher who saw what others missed. And finally, the triumph. The moment when the broken pieces came together and became something whole, something beautiful, something unbreakable. The twins played like they had never played before. Every note was perfect. Every transition was seamless. They breathed as one. They felt as one. 12 minutes of music that carried the weight of everything they had been through. When the last note faded, there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. Oliver Unk's heart was pounding. Henry's hands were shaking. They stood frozen on the stage, not knowing what to expect. And then it began. One person started clapping, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet. The applause was like thunder, rolling through the golden room and crashing over the two young men on stage. People were cheering. Some were crying. The other competitors backstage were watching with open mouths. The twins looked at each other. Tears were streaming down their faces. They had done it. They had taken their pain and turned it into something beautiful. At the judges' table, Richard Whitmore sat very still. His face was pale. His hands were not clapping. He was staring at the two young men on stage, and finally, after 2 long years, he remembered. The applause lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Oliver and Henry stood on that golden stage, tears running down their faces, watching hundreds of strangers rise to their feet for 2 boys from Detroit who had taught themselves to play music in a room above a laundromat. When the clapping finally faded, the twins walked off the stage in a daze. Their legs felt weak. Their hearts were still racing. They found a quiet corner back, stage, and held on to each other, unable to speak, unable to process what had just happened. Other competitors came to congratulate them. Musicians who had looked at them with doubt just hours ago now shook their hands and patted their backs. A young pianist from Germany told them it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. A chist from Japan bowed deeply and said he was honored to share the stage with them. But the twins barely heard any of it. They were thinking about their grandmother, sitting alone in that small apartment in Detroit, waiting by the phone for news. They were thinking about Eleanor, who had believed in them when she had no reason to. They were thinking about all the nights they had practiced until their fingers bled, wondering if any of it would ever matter. It mattered. It all mattered. The results would not be announced until the evening ceremony. The twins had 6 hours to wait. 6 hours of not knowing if their performance had been enough to win or if they would go home with nothing but memories. They left the concert hall and walked through the streets of Vienna. The sun was setting, painting the old buildings in shades of gold and pink. They found a small park with a wooden bench and sat down, their instrument cases beside them. "Do you think we won?" Henry asked. Oliver shook his head slowly. "I do not know. But right now, I do not care about winning. Did you see their faces? Did you hear them clapping? They understood us, Henry. They felt what we were trying to say. That is more than I ever dreamed of." Henry nodded. He understood exactly what his brother meant. For so long they had been invisible. 2 poor boys with broken instruments and no proper training. Nobody had taken them seriously. But today, for 12 beautiful minutes, the whole world had listened. They sat in silence, watching the sky change colors, feeling the cool evening breeze on their faces. Whatever happened next, they had already proven something important. They had proven that talent and hard work and love could overcome anything, even laughter, even doubt, even a conductor who thought he knew everything. At 7, they returned to the music fair for the awards ceremony. The grand hall was packed with musicians, judges, families, and music lovers from around the world. Cameras were set up to broadcast the event to millions of viewers. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The twins found seats near the back. They held hands, something they had not done since they were children. Their palms were sweaty. Their hearts were pounding. The ceremony began with speeches from various officials. Then the 3rd-place winner was announced, a violinist from South Korea. The crowd applauded warmly. 2nd place went to a pianist from Russia. More applause, more cameras flashing. And then The moment came. The head judge, an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, stepped up to the microphone. She held an envelope in her hands. "This year's competition Ion has been extraordinary," she said. "We have seen incredible talent from every corner of the world, but one performance stood above all others. A performance that moved every single judge to tears. A performance that reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place." She opened the envelope. The first place winners of the International Virtuoso competition are Oliver and Henry from the United States for their original composition, Unbreakable. The hall exploded with applause. People jumped to their feet. The twins sat frozen for a moment, unable to believe what they had heard. Then Henry grabbed Oliver's arm and pulled him up. They walked to the stage in a daze, their legs barely working, their eyes blurry with tears. They received their trophy, a beautiful golden figure holding a violin. They received a check for $50,000, more money than they had ever seen in their lives. They received handshakes and hugs and words of congratulation from judges and officials. But there was one person who had not come to congratulate them: Richard Whitmore. The twins saw him standing near the side of the stage watching them. His face was unreadable. He did not clap. He did not smile. He simply stood there as if waiting for something. After the ceremony ended and the crowds began to thin, the conductor finally approached them. The twins stiffened. Oliver felt the old anger rising in his chest. Henry's jaw tightened. Richard Whitmore stopped in front of them. Up close, he looked older than they remembered, tired. Somehow, the arrogance that had seemed so powerful 2 years ago now looked like a mask that was starting to crack. "You probably do not remember me," he said quietly. Oliver Unk's voice was cold. "We remember everything," the conductor nodded slowly. He looked down at the floor, then back up at their faces. "I was wrong," he said. "That day in Chicago, I judged you before I listened. I saw your clothes and your instruments, and I decided you were not worth my time. That was not just unprofessional. It was cruel." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "What you played today was not just music. It was truth. It was pain and hope and love, all woven together into something I have never heard before. I have been conducting orchestras for 30 years, and I have never been so moved by a performance." Henry spoke now, his voice steady. Richard Whitmore flinched as if the words had physically hurt him. "I know," he said, "and I am sorry. I am truly deeply sorry. I cannot take back what I did. But I can tell you this: you have changed me. The way I look at young musicians, the way I think about talent and training and worth. You have taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." He extended his hand. Oliver looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at his brother. Henry gave a small nod. Oliver shook the conductor's hand. Not because he had forgiven him completely. Forgiveness would take time, but because holding on to anger would only hurt themselves. "We did not come here for your apology," Oliver said. "We came here for ourselves, to prove what we knew all along." Richard Whitmore nodded. "And you have more than you know." He walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving the twins alone with their trophy and their victory and their future. That night they called their grandmother. She answered on the first ring as if she had been sitting by the phone for hours. "We won, grandmother," Henry said, his voice breaking. The sound that came through the phone was half laugh, half sob. Dorothy could not speak for a long time. When she finally found her voice, she said only one thing: "Your grandfather is smiling in heaven tonight." The twins returned to Detroit as heroes. Their story was covered by newspapers and television stations across the country. The two boys who taught themselves music and conquered the world. Offers came pouring in, scholarships to the best conservatories, invitations to perform at concert halls in New York and London and Tokyo. But before they accepted anything, they went back to that small apartment above the laundromat. They sat with their grandmother at the kitchen table drinking cheap tea just like they had done all their lives. And they made a promise. They would use their success to help others like them. Children with talent but no resources. Dreamers who needed someone to believe in them. They would create a foundation, a music school, a place where no child would ever be laughed at for daring to dream. They called it unbreakable because that is what they were, and that is what they would help others become.